This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Shifting a little money here, a little there, and hoping it all works out? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can be a better budgeter and potentially lower your insurance bill too. You tell Progressive what you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll help you find options within your budget. Try it today at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
When unprecedented times are all the time, it's time to start walking the talk with PwC. Leaders like you turn to PwC to see and stay ahead. Upskill your workforce, use intelligent automation, and transform big ideas into breakthrough outcomes. Explore the human-led, tech-powered solutions that help you thrive. It's all part of PwC. Learn more at pwc.com.
It's November 29th, 1962, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
So until this day, there had been two teams developing supersonic aircraft in Europe, the French and the British. But on this day, the British and the French announced they would be combining resources, not really to kind of build a European dream and work together ebony and ivory, but just because it was costing so much. It had already cost the British £150 million in developing what became known as Concorde.
And rather than being a commercial deal, the project was negotiated as an international treaty between France and the UK. This was at the time when the UK was trying to get into the European Economic Community. And so there was this kind of concept that it was going to be two nations working side by side. And also, probably worth noting for the rest of the story is that like a lot of stuff was state-owned that isn't now. So British Airways is state-owned at the time. So there was a lot more enmeshment between the government and the private sector, especially in fields like aviation, probably left over from the war. I'm just making this up, but probably left over from the war. Is that, do you think that's
our USP. Anyone's come to us from any of the other daily history podcasts, there you go. you get spontaneous made-up history here.
Finger in the air stuff. Yeah.
What's your hunch, Arion?
But what they came up with was an aeroplane that was notable for two things. One, of course, was that it was technologically superior to everything that had come before insofar as it was faster than all the other commercial jets that had flown. But the other thing that it was just massively luxurious. And it's not surprising, I suppose, because it came to be a plane that was used by people who wanted to get places and get places quickly.
Yeah, I mean, who really needs to shave an hour and a half off their journey to New York apart from David Frost?
Yes, yeah. But it became known for the celebrities who rode on it, also because it was very small. You know, it actually had this quite dinky little cabin because, you know, it was very aerodynamically superior, and consequently it needed to, you know, be quite narrow. It was quite a thin tube to slice through the air. But you know, inside, even though it was cramped, it was hugely, hugely luxurious with the best of everything you could possibly hope for, including like the best food and the best design and the best designed uniforms on the part of the stewards.
Someone's sad they didn't get to go on Concorde, aren't they, Rebecca? Can you hear? He's got a very well thought through fantasy about it all.
The undoing of Concorde really was that it came about at this sort of crossroads where the US were also working on supersonic planes. And so the leading thought was like, obviously this is going to be the next thing because they're much faster. But what actually happened was that no other supersonic passenger planes got made. And at the same time that Concorde was stuck in this sort of 1960s Pan Am fantasy land of, you know, luxury, popping champagne, or, you know, with all these fancy, well-dressed air hostesses milling around you, is that what was actually happening in the rest of the world was that subsonic planes, you know, what we would consider normal passenger jets, were proliferating all over the world. And there was this expectation that air travel would soon be widely available and affordable for the masses, which was completely at odds with what Concorde was doing. So by being on the cutting edge in the 60s, because the project was so expensive and long-winded, by the time it actually came into operation in the late 70s, the whole economics of aviation had completely changed.
Yeah, you mentioned Pan Am. I mean, they had an order for Concordes, you know, as did most other developed nations in the world. And then slowly over time, everyone dropped out apart from those French and British national carriers, and only 16 were built in the end. That's partly because the Americans stopped developing their supersonic plane. So as you mentioned, Rebecca, JFK actually launched a kind of moonshot type pitch, design the next generation of supersonic planes to rival what's going on in Britain and France. And the Americans eventually spent $400 million getting a wooden mock-up made, but nothing that ever flew, because in the meantime what happened is the 747 came along from Boeing. It was more economical, it had a longer range, it carried hundreds more passengers, and it turned out that actually maybe speed isn't as important as the ticket price.
And that was a problem for Concorde from the very beginning. When it first launched in 1976, a round trip cost $1,500.
Wow. In 1976 money, that's like £15 million.
I think that's accurate. Well, so by the end, it was $12,000 for a seat one way and back.
I mean, that's a lot of money to pay for a few extra hours, isn't it?
Apparently, within Concorde itself, it was incredibly loud, particularly if you were sitting near the twin Rolls-Royce engines that were having raw fuel dumped into them to get you to Mach speed.
It sounds like hell to me, Rebecca. What about you?
I mean, I absolutely hate flying. Planes are too fast for me already.
Yeah, you're phobic, right? So would Mach 2 be worse for you because it's faster, you get there quicker, but it's also louder, and you're trapped in a cubicle with Michael Winner and some British Airways food? Is that worse?
You've outlined my worst nightmare. According to some people who flew in it, if you passed over a Boeing, because Concordes were travelling at like 60,000 feet, so they were well above all the other planes, but if you travelled over, say, a Boeing, normal plane, it would look like the Boeing was going backwards because the Concorde was going at like 1,000 miles per hour. There was actually, you were saying, Arion, about how noisy they were. Also, they got very hot because of travelling so fast. The speed limit was not to do with the power of the plane. It was limited by how hot the aluminium fuselage would get. And so there was this incident where Pepsi had purchased a sponsorship deal with Air France in 1996, and part of the deal was that the Concorde would be painted in sort of Pepsi blue, but because they had been painted white specifically to keep the temperatures down, the plane was unable to fly at maximum speed, which obviously was a bit of a damp squib for Pepsi.
Well, it was actually a piece of metal, I don't know if it was a Pepsi can, in the end, that pierced the tyre that caused the Air France crash that sort of presaged the end of Concorde, wasn't it? Which seemed to stagger everybody involved. It was the most tested plane of all time, and it was designed to survive a window being shot out at 50,000 feet. And yet, ultimately, it came undone in this horrific accident that killed everyone on board by a piece of metal on the runway.
Yeah, and I mean, Concorde had been struggling for so long before this accident happened in the year 2000. The government had already sold their planes to British Airways in 1983. But the one thing that Concorde still had going for it, as you say, Olly, was this perception that it was incredibly safe. It wasn't just luxury, it was this advanced technology, and that it wasn't susceptible to any of the things that would bring down other planes. However, it was taking off from Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport on its way to New York. There was some kind of debris on the runway which damaged the tyre. Then pieces of the tyre flew up into the plane, rupturing the fuel tank, damaging the wing, and it erupted into a fire. It was awful. And then so the plane actually crashed 2 minutes after leaving the ground. It crashed into a hotel. So not only were all 109 people on board killed, 4 people in the hotel were killed too.
You feel that they would have retired these planes anyway just because they were such a money loser, and also probably because standards of luxury, which came to be the thing that people were going on Concorde for, were lifted so dramatically in the decades since Concorde first took to the skies.
Yeah, I used the word presage deliberately because it wasn't actually the crash that killed Concorde. Concorde was intending to come back. It was then 9/11 that really did for it, because there was a year out of the sky whilst they were attempting to make sure that could never happen again. And then the day that they did their test flight, can you believe, was the 10th of September 2001. And then no one could fly into New York for a time after that. And bizarrely, a lot of the customers for Concorde were killed on 9/11 because they worked in the World Trade Center. And not only the customers who frequently flew Concorde, but also the managers. You lost the people at all of these corporations based in New York that used to give permission to spend that kind of money on a fast plane ticket.
Yeah, because of the shape of the plane and because it had a big fuel capacity, it could seat a maximum of 128 passengers. And, as we discussed, the prices were incredibly prohibitive. So it was kind of like an exclusive club. It was the same people flying backwards and forwards, which, is actually quite sweet, but it's not really that much of a business model.
Nonetheless, I think you have to account for the fact that there was an opportunity there to build a state-subsidised aeroplane company that could genuinely be world-beating, and basically we flunked it and the French didn't. Like, the French did create Airbus as a direct consequence of building Concorde, and yet Britain doesn't make planes anymore.
It is kind of mad, isn't it, to think, like, in this world where it seems like we're constantly moving forward, there was a time 30 years ago where you could fly from New York to London in 3 hours, and you can't do that now. You're still on 6 or 7 hours for that kind of a journey. We were there and we just don't do it anymore.
The record flight was apparently 2 hours, 52 minutes and 59 seconds.
Wow, so if Titanic was the onboard movie, you wouldn't even be able to watch it all. Although, to be honest, that would be a poor choice of in-flight film.
You could just get Leonardo DiCaprio to talk you through it, because he'd be sitting next to you.
And so another week of retrospecting ends. But next week begins a day early at Club Retrospectors. Join us now to get an exclusive episode every Sunday. Patreon.com/retrospectors.
Hello, I'm Vaskar Sadulu, and I host the How To Academy podcast, a bi-weekly show exploring big ideas to transform our lives and the world. Our guests include Arthur Brooks on careers, Ruby Wax on mental health, Gabor Mate on trauma, Nicole LePera on healing your relationships, and many more. You'll also hear from iconic artists, politicians, and activists, including Naomi Klein, Gordon Brown, Anna Funder, and a whole host of other very impressive people. That's the How To Academy podcast, available bi-weekly wherever you listen.